a una modalità troppo semplificata, troppo rigida di comunicazione, ma che crede che la comunicazione debba essere qualcosa di estremamente più complesso, ricco e meno scontato, più dialogico, è il termine che usa sempre. E quindi, al di là di tutto, mi sembrava fondamentale che oltre al workshop ci fosse un'occasione di ascoltare dalla sua viva voce su un pubblico un po' più ampio che idea della comunicazione visiva ha. Quindi thank you Jan, thank you Els for being here, and my action is over, it's all for you.
This is it. Thank you. Good evening. Els and I are very happy with the invitation. More and more every day, it's more exciting to be here. It's a wonderful experience, Els, isn't it? Yeah. It brings also a lot for us. As you know, perhaps Els started the workshop on making meaning with a lecture called The Invention of Communication. A history of mentalities about, say, the coherence of strategies, meaning and form, against the background of socio-economic, ideological, and say, technological transformations. My talk, so it's the second lecture, that is at the moment that we go from, say, investing in our subject, the groups, the students, and getting to the visualization of these ideas. And there's always a kind of critical moment. Do you dare to swim? That is what we say, huh? Because there is the difference between thinking and rationalization of the whole process, constantly analyzing, etc., and to jump into the swimming pool and swim, because the visual is a bodily, sensorial activity, works different than, say, the analyzing, conceptual approach of what we do. They belong together, but we should, that's our conviction, we should invest again very much in the visual and make that, say, a message for really exchange. So that's what my talk is about. And it is what I said about, say, the theoretical insights, method, and the visual practice in one. So this is what Gérard Perry-Cavell, Grappus, I had it for years, and now for the first time I show you that we look, we think, and everything that we have to produce visual messages. We should realize that communication design is not a kind of plumber's manual. It's not a kind of plumber's manual, a tool that works for itself as a kind of interface that we are familiar with. But we read visual messages like poems, and that's quite other than road signs. Staging the message in my lecture is what I said about the practice, methods and means of communication design, about design as an integrated public practice. That's to say, a practice that is aware of the complicated conditions under which it produces. I often call that a visual or spatial, depends on where you work in, journalism, because it shows that the role, method, and the means of our trade is considerably broader than we generally adopt. Communication design certainly is a complicated social profession. Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, rightly puts us among the media intellectuals. having an undeniable public role, producing cultural values by serving private ends in the public arena, in public media. So for me, there's a reason to stay aware of the relationship between the social-cultural contexts and we produce in, and how designers, art directors, act in terms of strategy, conditions we produce in, and how we as designers, art directors, act in terms of strategy, meaning, and visual language use. For me, I feel rooted in a long tradition of editorial design. For me, an indispensable orientation and at the same time inspiring extension, now that our current practice increasingly produces identity instead of content and meaning. I think this speaks for itself, I would say. This is what you see, how to Read Donald Duck is a very important publication in the sense that it has been published in the time that in Chile was the name of that was the socialist government. And this is a publication that shows how the strip of Donald Duck in fact is a kind of translation or a kind of a strip that shows how capitalism works. And it's widely spread, and I can advise you to read it because it's really a pleasure to read it. It's not a kind of a very boring publication, but it's a lot of fun to read, and that's in such a funny way. So critique is not always bloody serious. It's serious, but you can present it in all kind of different ways. Okay, and then not to forget John Burgess' way of seeing here below, a very important book in the sense that it guides you through what the visual really is as an experience. It's not a kind of a history book of facts, but it helps you to look, to discover, to experience. And yeah, Grappus, of course, is for an exhibition of their own works in Breda, and because they have that kind of political orientation and social orientation. This is the rebellious dog fucking a police dog. So it tells something of the mentality that you have to twist the given, the established. And so this to show you that you can go back in a long history of design as a tool of communication, that and a long tradition that you question, say, the established, also in form. And that's why, so this is what I say, this is about method. The first chapter is about method. What I did, and I go a little bit further now and talk about strategies. Sorry. So mentality. The current generation of designers, visual producers in the media certainly are not the first who face questions about social role and the workings of the work. Pierre Bourdieu, I mentioned him already, is right in that respect. Media producers should liberate their thinking and making constantly from the minimum standards of say, the modernist, late modernist regime, and transcend their time by investing in a more meaningful and liberating human form of visual communication, of communication in general. This was a kind of introduction, and now we get to strategies of communication design or art. What I'll do as an introduction, point to, at the left, you see an object, speaks for itself. It's the closed eyes, or Marco Jean Spectre, the gardenia, it's there, and it's closed in itself. Even the eyes are. But how different is Raphael from here? In this painting, lost painting, from his boy or girlfriend, we don't know. This is a kind of visual piece to discover things. Is it the boy, is it the girl? What kind of landscape? So it's inviting you, it's looking at you, and there are additional elements in it, in the right corner. And when you look to this, what's happening here, it's a painting in itself. So it's a kind of visual richness that makes it what we call in semiotics an event, something to discover, to explore, so different from the object that speaks for itself, close to itself. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's only to make it clear. Sorry. I forgot to mention my poster I made for in '82 for an exhibition in Breda, that a series of posters that dealt, in this case, one of the 7 I did, with the Russian Revolution. How to expose such the subject and at the same time give it an update, bringing things together that have a kind of dynamic in itself and make you look again. And not the object, but again, something that you can explore. We get to, we go further with the strategies. Here again, something added to the object and the event. You see the formal, that's a kind of a term I've chosen for the occasion. There is a formal approach, intellectually, conceptually, that brings you to all kinds of things we come on later. But you see how there is a clear structure, a measure. Everything is object, exposed as an object. There is some coherence, but in a way it's like you see below. This is about, say, interior, mag wel die gute form, but the pictures are illustrations to the text. You read text and you understand what you see. So you don't offer, say, that the visual has the capacity to show you the world, to connect you with the world, like Lisitsky did in many exhibitions and also his work. And that's what we call the event. The message as an event, something to explore. You discover, you come back and there's more, and there's a kind of hierarchy of signs. You see, at first you see something, a gesture, but when you go further on, you discover, like you in a city or a marketplace, find things. And that means that you experience, you build up knowledge or experience, the event. Als Kuipers is working on that in your studies already for some time. So you could talk about the spectrum. So at the one end is the classical conception of form as an artwork, an object, the artwork as an object, the idea that the work speaks for itself, so a rather static notion of the work, formal, static, closed in itself, like a road sign, What is it? Speaks for itself. And we go to so that's a kind of a line of strategies. And the other end of that spectrum, you could say, is the work as an event, like in Lissitzky's case. And that is an unfinished, activating, and therefore dialogic assemblage of devices. It's open, there is it's an arguing, storytelling attitude. And the visual, that's the power of the visual, I would say. Like every movie, the good movies then prove, and the daily experience is the same. When we talk with each other, or the way we behave, that is a bodily exchange in many ways, apart from the words, in combination with the words. So this second dialogic assemblage is also called structuration, an interesting term, I think, because it sees the message as unfinished, an integrated, dynamic concept of its operations, its workings. It signifies a structure, and it's in action. It's open, constantly in a process of reconstituting itself, because it's a storytelling. There's a storytelling open nature in an open exchange with the viewer. And the wonderful thing when you work on that is that there is a kind of inner dynamics, where we get to that later. And in Lissitzky's work is a great example of that. How, like we find our way in the marketplace or in the city by sensorial experience. Here you see, and that's what I will follow, so there is the formal object, and there is the informal event, and that formal and informal says something about the form, the way you deal with form. And this is the fantastic hygiene exhibition in Dresden, or the fur exhibition in Dresden in 1930, and you see that it's this design, it is organized, it's well organized, but it's so inviting to explore it, to experience it. And here you see Maholi, where, as an example of the formal, a very formal way. It's beautiful, but you see that the image is a kind of piece, as as an illustration of the rest. It loose elements. It's so really formal in its construction, in composition. And Lissitzky there, so when you see the rest of the exhibition, it's fascinating. It's connected to life, to daily experience. We are still in strategies. Here you see Italian futurism, Marinetti, very typical for the futurism in Italy is that it had a really formal attitude. Else told me, different from the Russian, where you have a much more attitude to working, how things work. But this was, say, a more literary approach. Fantastic, of course. It seems to be liberated, but it has formal, that is what it does. So different from Lissitzky's For the Voice, the text of Mayakovsky, where it is looking for a kind of language that has formal aspects, but at the same time, it is a rebellion to the given. And that's why I have chosen Oscar Jorn from the Situationist movement. They were really trying to break the norm. to liberate yourself from the given, ordinary, everyday language, the established language, to open it up, to deal with the world in another way. And then that expresses itself in this type of way of approaching the audience. Yeah. This is, we go from strategies, that scala of strategies with all this position, we go to pragmatics. And pragmatics is an idea, a notion that comes from semiotics. And for me, and I think many other people with this kind of approach, going back to the non-intellectual, to visual communication, pragmatics is very important. That's about science and the relations to the interpreters. So the way we communicate and how it works. It's an important tool when you look to your piece that you are designing, how it approaches the audience, the viewer. The heading is pragmatics, and on the left you see a global wealth pyramid, and this is from the Credit Suisse in 2016. And this represents the very wealthy on top and the poorest part of the world population on the basis. But it could be also something else, isn't it? It says nothing about the subjects. It could be used, that is statistics. Nothing wrong with it, but there is no identification with the subject. And so I was asked with some 17 other designers in Holland and also 17 from Denmark and France to make a poster about, say, 17 points of attention of the United Nations. And so I used this pyramid, and when you translate it in numbers, you get this. 26% of the world owns 79.6% of global wealth, and the rest is left with 70.3%. It is, in fact, 2.4% of it. And that's already much more information, but it's still in text. So, but I was trying to give it identity, not stay in the abstraction, by using portraits of some of the extremely rich. Otherwise, when you have the other one, as I started, it's a design in itself, but there is no identity with the subject. There's no connection. But for me, it's very essential when you do this kind of thing that it is not the design. The design is a means to talk about, to show something. So that's what content is. At first sight, you should see what it is about, an identification with the subject, instead of a design. And we live in a time now that most of the design functions as a kind of identity instead of content, in spite of its beautiful form. So this was a tough exercise, I must say, to find out a kind of a clue how you could show it. And I'm still hesitant, but nevertheless it was an attempt to, just in this case, also, when you look to most of the colleagues from the three countries, we dealt with the same kind of subjects. I would say 80% of it, isn't it else, about that, were beautiful designs, but it was a kind of personal statement and had no identity with the subject. they were dealing with. And it was really disappointing because my attempt is to all the time to offer meaning first, and the design should be well done, but it has a serving position too. So you see on the left, still Pragmatics, the workings. This is the stamp of €1 with the Dutch king. And that isn't the Dutch king, isn't it? There's a kind of, it can be everybody. But it's well designed. So, the other two is a former Prime Minister in Holland, Dr. Willem Drees. He was, at that time, it was his 100th birthday. So he was very old. But after the war, he was Prime Minister and responsible for social care, health care, etc., or pensioning. So there was after the war was very necessary. Social Democrat, and with the commissioner, or Oksana, a colleague, head of the design office of the Dutch Post. We started to discuss what to do with Mr. Drees. He's a social democrat. He's all the time photographed playing a kind of ball game in the dunes and in this kind of costume. This is an official photo of the social democrat after the Second World War. So I tried to combine that with the colors of his coalition government, the yellow of the Roman Catholics and the reddish of the socialists. And we were both very happy with it, and also the general, the director general of the Dutch Post. And then it came to the Prime Minister's office at the time, and officially he couldn't say no to it, but he advised to look for another one because you couldn't represent Prime Minister laying in the dunes. So I ended up with a more formal solution. The Prime Minister entering the Dutch Parliament with these famous social laws, and everybody in Holland, the older people, know that. So we both loved the other one because this was really what he was. That's the way he wanted to be. But so I had to go to a more formal, still informal, trying to be informal, but not so good and not so, the identity is different, I would say. So you always, I'm talking about strategies, you always can find an answer to. But still, identity is essential. That's another. That's a stamp I did for the commemoration of the February strike. There was a strike against the pogroms or the youth in Amsterdam. So I tried to make a stamp, but actualize it because of the European, the labor unions, I think, organized and using this signal of stopping discrimination. So again, first the message, the content, and find a form for it. And that has also an identity, but it's that doubleness that invites you, that storytelling nature, that helps people to recognize, dialogically. We're still in pragmatics. Information graphics is, I think, a very interesting field, and it's striking that information graphics is often seen as actual and factual, objective as information. But I think nothing is further from the truth. There is a plurality of forms when you start at the left and top, Simon Sévin was in the 16th century a well-known scientist, and he produced these pictures of how weight is balanced, and it's fascinating to see. You see it larger than I do, but how you immediately understand what is at stake. Where the weight, how to do it. And when you go through this, how do you call it, natural sciences, through that book, it's fascinating that, like Els also showed, it's kind of making pictures that make you understand what happens without a word, along with the text. The same goes more or less, some different way, for the Russian campaign of Napoleon going to Moscow, and that's about the numbers, of course, that you immediately see what a disaster it is. It's fascinating. Going there with I don't know how many people, and it ends up with nearly nothing. 19th century. And not to forget Otto Neurath and Gerd Ernst producing just after the First World War, beginning with this statistics, maps of, not maps, but cardboard plate. So this is statistics with an identity. You immediately know what it is about. So it's not abstract. There is an identity. You know what it is about. Dead babies or whatever strikes, whatever you think, you immediately recognize this is about cars, this is about coal production. It's not, so I think that's very essential. We lost that in the last century, I would say, for an important part. But we shouldn't forget that this works much faster, that identity and gives meaning and accessibility. And the one at the right, the Occupied Times of London, that's by students of the LCC, and a website that deals with all kinds of social and problems, social economic problems, and but also a way to give an identity or something you recognize to what the information is about, instead of the abstractness of the so-called facts. And this is interesting, that's Luc Deleu, that's an architect in Antwerp, and this is about the exploration of urban space. And it looks very complicated, but the nice thing is that it's always, when you open a certain place, it's always a recognition of the subject, and then follow the facts. So it doesn't stay in the abstract. Informal. We continue with pragmatics. In fact, it is what I'm doing now, is trying to do, is that visual language and its working is very important. When it is abstract, you stay, you have a distance, you can't connect with it. So the dialogic aspect, by the identification and the narrative of the visual message is essential for a better understanding and placing things in your life experience. You see at the left, Jacques Bertin, and that's rather that starts just after the Second World War, I would say. That is a French, how do you call this? It's about statistics, but really a scientific approach, and very important for the development of statistics. But it's abstract, you see. It's very difficult. It's a system in itself, so it stays at distance. It's really formal and stays an object. What you see at that comes later. Let's see. Here, that's something from the 90s in a book about American statistics. Here, that you see that there's a kind of wonderful form. It's exciting, but it tells nothing about the subject. So it's fascinating, but what is it about? Yeah, it has something to do with sexuality. No, you say it could be. But you see how say this formal approach, you end up in this kind of nonsense. And the book was full, a fantastic book, because the state of art in the field of statistics, and I was so formal and well designed to be jealous of, but nothing to recognize before you read something. This is the Al Jazeera website, and it's fascinating to see that doesn't start with text, or there is text, but the visual comes first. It's really wonderful, and you have access not via headings but via visual collage. And there is you have a big one and then smaller ones, so there's a hierarchy of signs to enter it in a visual way. Could be that has to do with many people who are not literate. You see, the illiterate part of the population is much larger. But it's fascinating how the visual can help you. Sorry, I want something else. So, oh, and here below you see such a thing. The visual gives access in a kind of hierarchy of pictures, smaller and larger ones, and then you start to read. It's an interesting example. Huh? And for example, that's why I show The Guardian. In The Guardian, it's a fantastic newspaper, but all pictures are illustrations to the text. You start to read, and you have an illustration. And it's exactly the opposite. And on purpose I do it in an extreme way to show that there are more possibilities than the ones we are used to. Below is the Bureau d'Etudes, perhaps you know that, it's a French design scientist design, and it's unbelievable. They map the world, and there was an exhibition in The Hague in 2006, and there were all these walls completely filled with statistics, and it was fantastic. It is unbelievable what people can do. But there was a kind of a desert of science that you hardly could manage. So it's there, but it stays in the abstract because it's so difficult to have access to it. Still with pragmatics. And this is, say, the formal object. That's why I try to show you how we live nowadays in a world of fantastic design, but mostly very formal in its solutions. When you look at it, you have no idea what it is about. Form is the first thing you see as an identity. So I have you admire the solutions, wonderful designers. When you look to the names, it's very important in the development. But when you look at the characteristics, what to do with it? Huh? Metahaven presented themselves in the design museum with a wonderful story about the commitment of design. But when you look to the right, that's the left for your continent. It's more decoration than that you have an identity. But at the same time, you're jealous that you're capable of organizing that, and there is motivation. It's very serious. It's not nonsense. But it ends up in a wonderful, very strong, formal presentation. And for me, that's really a pity. So I would say that the design is not politicized in whatever way. Yeah? So it's not dialogic. You have to read and admire, or being jealous as a colleague. Huh? And so formal, also in its working, because to have access to what the message is about, it takes much more. And it's more difficult to identify yourself with it and to really have access to what it is about. Still pragmatics, and this is a strange combination. What you see here is Benedict Taschen, the famous publisher, and his family on the occasion of, I don't know, a marriage with a new lady, I think. Huh? And it's unbelievable what images can do, isn't it? Compare that. So but it is formal. It's an object. What to do with it? You can swallow it. How different with this old painting of Peter Bruegel, the battle between Carnival and Land. And here you can explore, you can walk around, so to say, find out things, connect to things, being disappointed. So you can live with that for years, in fact, because it's dialogic. It tries to tell stories, and at the same time it's very well documented. It tries the whole complexity is there. Anton Becker, you knew him very well, Ko. So the stories about Anton Becker and the way he designed. I've always been jealous of Anton because he had a fabulous talent, and this is one of the pausen, hoe noem je dat? The Pope of Dutch design, Premsela, promoter of so many designers in Holland. Just before he died, and Anton Becker made a poster on the occasion of the art exhibition in Amsterdam with him, this well-known person, Benno Premsela, in this way, and it's fascinating. But that is the image as the ultimate sign, I would say, as an object. And daring at the same time. Huh? But it stays an object, and you admire the designer because of his daring approach. And he also worked for the Stedelijk Museum, made wonderful posters. But the first thing what happens is you see the designer and not the subject. So the identity of the design comes before the message. And the narrative of Bruegel is different. So the tradition of Bruegel, that looking to the world upside down, as it's called many times. This is a double page of a booklet of mine. I tried to deal with Berlusconi, to follow Bruegel's upside down and finding a picture and putting as a kind of a gesture to show that you can, the moment you have it, like in Anton Beker's case, readable, you swallow it, disappears as an incident. But when you turn it upside down, like Bruegel is doing all the time, not in a literary way, but in the confrontation between the number of elements, you look somewhat longer to find out what's happening. So informal, an event that tries to invite people to look, to experience the narrative, the visual narrative. Yeah, what I wrote down is that Anton Beker's spectacular poster is at the same time rebellious and has a formal beauty. So he's always, when it comes to the form, he opposes the norm as daring at that level of form. And that gives the message an identity, but in fact, the real content is on another level. You have to find out. So it's more promotion, I would say. And in that way, a more consensus-oriented spectacle, establishing and promoting a kind of worldview that stays at the surface. Because you have this wonderful surprise and admiration, but that's it. All three, Peter Bruegel and Anton and all the other ones I showed, have a plot. That's what we're doing in the workshop. We try to discuss the subject and find a kind of focus that would help us to construct the message content-wise and give form to that. And that is a very old method, and you still find that when you think about the theater, film, etc. So you work on an interpretation, or in music, you work on the interpretation of what the score is or what the text is, and then you find a way to express it, which isn't always an interpretation in a bodily sense, in a multisensorial sense, which is also in a visual way, and that's completely different from our conceptual existence. But you need both to get to a visually working, like in opera, for example. It's great when you have the score there and you think what people do before they get there. You discuss the interpretation and you start to practice and find out where you're after. That's what the visual in the workshop also asks you to do. And we'll start, we're now underway, and the rest of the week we will try to do that. A method to get to the point, to make the point visually that we all are after. We are still in pragmatics, but now event and informal examples. Hannah Hoog cut with a kitchen knife through the last Weimar beer belly cultural approach of Germany, just after the First World War, a collage, and that's absolutely informal. You have to explore, find your way, like you find your way in a market or whatever. And it's a great pleasure. So many things to discover. And at the right is Simon Davis, double page out of a brochure of a cultural event for weeks or months, I think, in the south of Amsterdam, bringing together so many cultures that live there. And this is the double page, but it was fascinating. Sorry, I do something different. So that's the only example I have. But brings elements together that invite you to discover. And the whole, so it's a kind of visual catalogue of activities. Happening, Fluxus was also a movement in the 70s that was striving for, say, an informal approach of the public, away from the established society and the alternative society. And it's a fascinating catalogue how all kind of typography is used to give identity, different identities to the text in there. And it's very easy to find your way. It's like you're part of what happened there. It reflects in a typographical way the attitude of the happenings and events that are taking place. And I have always been jealous of that, trying to organize things in such a way that the Commission asked for. So I would have loved to do that catalogue too. Is it go? You also? The kind of that to express that mentality, but not in a way of striving for form, a formal solution, but to bring that kind of exhibition, access to it, to the front. We get to syntax. One of the other semiotic tools we have. The grid, we're all familiar with the grid, isn't it? But there are many different ways to deal with the grid. What you see at the left is Wim Krauwel, the grid for the Stedelijk Museum, catalogues, posters, etc. So that it's very regular on a metric system, and it's never changed. And doing posters. What you see to the next is Karl Gerstner, the Swiss designer of the same age, I would say. But that is a flexible grid in that sense, that he has a grid for pictures, so a number of grids are used at the same time, but images ask for another size, for another way of handling than, say, the text, not to talk about captions. So here you have a kind of flexible system that you make choices, so that's much more capable of also in typographic way, but with images, a kind of build up a narrative. And when you look to Krauwel's system, it's always neat in place. So first of all, you experience that kind of, it's wonderful, it looks great, but a picture is never used on the basis of its visual qualities, but it's placed in the measures of the system. That's different by Karl Gerstner. It's nice to also show Le Corbusier's modular, which is like the golden rule, huh? No, what is that the right? That is a kind of system that you always make choices in. you have all kinds of different sizes, and you can mix them. So you make choices on the basis of what you think you need. And that's so wonderful. It's much more playful, because you never can find back this kind of rigid is not there. You take decisions on the basis of what you need, in a visual way, a typographical way, in whatever thing. So it's still visual editing with a system underneath, a structure that you hardly experience, but is there, but you can make it, but the piece much more lively than the strictness of Crowl. Will Sandberg, the designer the director of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, made, you see that below, there's an exhibition of him, he made also in the Stedelijk. He always used the grid here in the park. He put a strict grid in the park, and then have all the sculptures over there. But he was really a means to find your way. But he was looking to the trees and the sky and the roads, etc., to place the objects. So he used the grid only as a means to help him. To say, no, it should be there to next tree. Okay, that's one. So that's an arbitrary decision. That's completely different also from. So the grid is very helpful, but the moment it takes the lead, you're losing, say, yourself in formalities. And nothing wrong about this piece, but it's important that we recognize what we do in a visual way. And you see how Sandberg was dealing with exhibitions, hanging them on their own qualities and what they represent, making a narrative instead of separating everything. The most wonderful exhibition, I don't have a photo I've seen, was Arp's exhibition, the Swiss sculptor, and he had grass in the parts with grass in the museum rooms, and even with a kind of again forbidden to step on the grass. You see. Okay. So so playful, really Arp, I would say, informality. That was, in fact, this one that I had before. In fact, the grid has something like that, but you see how you can interrupt it. This is the kind of study of Koolhaas' office, and you see how they did a study for an enormous building, somewhere in the Middle East, and tried to break through to the flat surface with this rectangular thing. So that's the beginning of this, to twist, to blow the conceptual approach. You recognize that, Carl? But you see, here is in fact what we call an articulation scheme for an exhibition Co and I worked on. Huge has one part of it, a chapter, and you see how in the size of the things you see, that there is a hierarchy of signs. When you talk about structure, this hierarchy of signs is always there in the visual. What do you see first? How it's connected to other things? So you can guide your visual, the size, guides you through the space in this occasion. But also when you look at Bruegel, he is working there make things nearer to you, other things further away. So you all the time explore that space in that very natural way. And that we had a lot of comment, I remember, when that there was not a real signing system in Delta Expo. And it was a huge public project over 2 levels. But what we did, this hierarchy of signs, is a kind of natural, a way of natural wayfinding. Like you do that in the city. Your orientation is always from the biggest ones to the lower ones. And so you could use a grid, but it was not so necessary. And there was a lot of critique later on by the users. The people who were exploring the exhibition in the building, and so there was a kind of additional way to additional science system to help the people who couldn't find their way. But there was also an inquiry. But 88% of the visitors in that exhibition could find their way without problem. And the other ones were, the 12%, were the intellectual, higher educated people, the more conceptual oriented. They had problems to find their way. So this bodily, So this tendency that we make our tools as designer a formal element is something you should be very careful with. The structure means not a kind of written, no, it's a very flexible thing to use. You know? When you know that a Gothic cathedral has a very thick grid overall, but what's coming up there is you don't discover it anymore. It could be the pillars or so, but it's only a tool. But what's standing there is there for another reason, not for the tool. It should not be controlled by the tool too much. We are at Aristotle's. Yeah. We are now, so we still talk about syntax. And this is more in a typographical way. You see how. Yeah. So this is again the formal and the informal in typography. At the left you see that it's what's it called? The neue Typografie. And you see how strict such all pictures, in spite of whatever is happening there, is framed in this strict setup. How different at the right, what is more, when you look what the picture is about, and there you see a hierarchy of signs. There's a kind of introduction that makes clear, and also the text, it's more like a newspaper or a big magazine that's visually organized in a way that you find your way. And you're not, of course, there is a kind of way you lead people, but the visual has its own role to fulfill, and at the same time with the text. And that's the long, tradition in, for example, in British, American, and French magazines. The famous British tradition of visual journalism that you hardly find nowadays anymore, but it's still an example how all senses can be used, and when you do it well, all senses are used to give you information. Complexity is not a problem, but it's something you have to find a solution for, and it's all there, but we seem to forget it now that we work on these machines. The machines are capable to do it, but we are leaning so much on the systems in the machine that we forget that there is a that the visual world, the visual communication is much more richer than the tools that are in here. But it's not the machine, it's us. All these things are I'll say what we see here is mostly made on the computer. When you go back to Aristotle, you see what they do, a hierarchy of signs in reading. It's so old. And we know that from newspapers or more informal, but so we are forgetting that there is more than, say, the system. We see here, and still at syntax, we speak about syntax. And Giuseppe Taragni, you're familiar with Giuseppe Taragni, of course, it's great. But when you compare him with Kurt Schwitters, you see, or with Lissitzky, there's an enormous difference, I think. Here, the design as such, the gesture as such is so overwhelming that it's losing its narrating nature. It's still unbelievable that was possible. When you look at Schwitters, that's all that stays dynamic in its nature. It's informal, more accessible, exchangeable, dialogic. You can explore it every day and finding new ways. Taragni is, you're flabbergasted, you're standing there, you're taken by it. But nevertheless, it's unbelievable it's a pity we didn't experience it. But when you compare it carefully with Lissitzky, Lissitzky is always twisting the gesture. It's always a narrative. There can be a strong signal, but next to it happens something different. You can end up in a completely informal way of offering things. So we are now in exhibiting. What you will see here, still syntax, structure. The National History Museum in London, the 19th century setup, you see that there is a kind of way of organizing things, especially in the Natural History Museums. You could really find that in how you present things so that they are accessible in a visual way. It's unbelievable. And now you hardly can find these things, but when I go back to my 20s or so, in Paris, in London, everywhere, the 19th century museum had a kind of organizing the visual that you, no words at all, only names, etc. But you understand what's at stake. Yeah? That's different from Ray and Charles Eames' Mathematics, famous tentoonstelling in '61, so that's after the World War. That's very modernistic, but it is a kind of based on a text. They have a text, and then so there is no visual coherence like in the one in the Natural Museum, but it's the text, the thinking, that's the way you hang. So there is hardly any connections between the things you show. And nothing for or before or against, but it's important to know that you have different ways of dealing with things. What you see here, the Natural History Museum, the 19th century part. In this Nick Bell, the Science Museum, in 2010, the new interior, and you see here, it's unbelievable. It's a kind of, it's fascinating, but it's more form. It looks like kind of entertainment instead that it informs you. It's very spectacular. And you most of the time are in the dark and then finding things. So the presentation becomes more, as a gesture, more important, the formal side of it, than the pieces you deal with, the pieces you show. That's really what you see many times nowadays. And at the right is heterostyrol as an extreme example of, say, a wonderful intention, but showing something that you don't know what it is about. It brings formal elements in and when you read, you understand what's at stake. And it's beautiful, but what happens there is without that, not accessible, but at the same time it's so well done. And it's also very committed in a political sense, as a critique to the media. So that is kind of, the two below represent what kind of state, or the state of the art in design we are in. The spectacular, the event. And so much craftsmanship and also motivation. But it should not be end in the gesture as such, as a spectacle. And this is interesting. Thomas Hirschhorn, how the artist, Swiss artist, isn't it? And how he thinks about, say, the connection. Thanks so much. How he thinks about the how the artist is related to the audience, and how meaning functions. And that's, he thinks that the audience will get it, but and there is a critique or comment of the people who organize this kind of events, and that comes back to the artist, and that's for the artist the way he again develops new things. But it's a rather naive view of human communication when you think about semantics. So this is a kind of very elite idea that the artist produces. There are people who criticize it, and then you have the evaluation by the specialist back to the artist. So it's kind of elitist idea of human communication that brings us to this kind of spectacular event that is very difficult to experience it. But what is it more than a kind of rather superficial experience, content-wise? Architecture, still syntax. You see in the left, you see MRDV, and that's architecture. They have a method of working that's really a describing encyclopedic approach. And you see here, for the Dutch pavilion in Hanover in 2000, how they were thinking in these layers. So it's an inventarization of possibilities to set up this. When you enter, you go from one floor to the other, etc., and ending with in the Queen's Place on top, and etc. All kind of Dutch events. But it's when you think that this is an inventarization of possibilities, and then you put them on top, and that's it. And as such, it's very helpful to do that. But when you were there, it's a kind of, how do you call it, display. It was a kind of party, decoration, but hardly any information, and it's experience. And that's why I show Oma, Rem Koolhaas, and And they work in a completely different way. So this is, say, the describing, the formal describing inventarization that ends up in a product and is characterized very regular. Oma questions the brief of the say commission all the time to stay away from, say, the given. When you think about the museum and the way it's organized since the 18th century or so, or even before, that is a kind of a strict a plan that develops spatially and organizes the way you expose the objects. It's a kind of a program. And it's very difficult to, when you are making an exhibition there or hanging things, to get rid of that. You're forced to that kind of hanging very regularly, etc. So it's very difficult to follow, make a kind of a narrative, the objective presentation in a way. That's only one example. But when you want to develop another approach, it's like Lissitzky already in the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, found out, both, and perhaps also Bruegel in his paintings, they were not, say, satisfied with that given strict programmatic approach of former time. They rethink the brief, they rethink the content in the light of actual circumstances, and ask themselves, and this is a quote from Koolhaas, how to make believable buildings in the age of too many icons, things in itself. So to get to another programmatic development of the building. So make a building, make a public building is not the point, but how to make building public. So this is again not the formal, but the informal, make the building an experience that deals with human, say, habitus, accessible in a way. And that's and therefore it's very interesting that the proposals of OMA for the very big library in Paris in '89, it's not built. They were thinking about this kind of floating element in the building for the big library, for the books, for the storage, and at the same time, and it's only just not the form, but in that huge building, there were spaces with certain characteristics. So you'll find the places not only by a kind of a design system, but also because they have an identity in themselves, rethinking the brief. And they still act, and when they have a commission for whatever building, they question that. Again, always the question. And very interesting for me was this exhibition in the Kunsthal in Rotterdam about the work of OMA designed by themselves. Came from Berlin, where it was before, isn't it else? Yes, huh? And it looks like a chaos, but it isn't. You very easily find your way, so you're not forced to follow a certain path. Now it is visually and spatially that way organized that it uses your, say, bodily, sensory, multisensory capabilities to find your way. And it's not something that you're capable of doing that. I think that's very essential to recognize as a designer or an architect that you're not a kind of system-ridden designer. And here you see the maquette, the floor plan. It looks like a mess, but like we were doing, it's not. You find your way and you're freer, like in a marketplace. No problem to find your way in the marketplace or in the city. So my last chapter, semantics, so that's about meaning. What you see here, photographs mislead us, kill our emotions by presenting themselves as exact miniatures of reality, while they are nothing but symbols. That's something we should realize. What we produce are symbols. And that's, in a way, for me, that's a kind of freedom. And has a responsibility too. But and this is wonderful. What is this? Semantics, meaning. So documentary truth created in the established language of photography is always a regime of truth, like that of any language. There's always a regime, but it doesn't mean that the regime doesn't change all the time. Speaking Italian changes over the ages or in places or because of all kind of development. And that's the same in visual language. Like you can see in a long history of design, but also in culture, culture production. So, here, the informal event you see here, this is a famous photograph of the soldier Saracens, the US police, faltering the prisoners. And but at the right you see a lady from Riefenstahl photographing in the famous Nazi photographer before the Nazis. And going to Africa, producing photographs of people there in that kind of way. Absolutely object and formal beauty, not accessible, I would say. Terrible in a way, qua mentality, but also that it is an object that you can admire the beauty of, but that's it. It's stupid. It's still in itself. You have to accept it or not. Then on the left, this is something, this is informal. You can immediately deal with it in whatever way. And for me, it's always important to be aware of that. Is it an object or is it a story on the object? And I think our profession is always about it. And that's what we call the dialogic method. Semantics, it is about making meaning. In fine art you find so many examples. René Magritte painting his wife and how, what a trick. So this is all examples of informal way of dealing with your subject, trying to give things access, offering access, dealing with it. And you see how gestures are important. One of the tools that the way you, as a viewer, you approach that way, or you offer something that it's a narrative, like in the theater. Also semantics. Rieneke Dijkstra is very famous nowadays Dutch photographer, and she became well known by her beach series in the 90s. So that we are in semantics, something about semantics. Semantic is really about making meaning, about science and about science and the relations to the objects they stand for. But we should be aware that there is always a constant interpretation of the fact of the photograph according to like in spoken language, according to the regimes of the we communicate with. So when you look to the one on the left, that's really what's called the denotation. So that is what you see strict, standing there as a classic model, but it's formal as an object. But the one at the right is informal, it is a narrative. You can explore. And this one, Andre Dines, Marilyn Monroe, in her younger years, a photograph taken with her neighbor boyfriend. It's much more fascinating, the story you have access to. And that brings me to...
To go there?
Huh?
That brings me to go there. De school gaat bijna sluiten.
Oh yeah.
Dus
so, I'm nearly done. This is my last one, so don't worry. Still at semantics, and ending with the event and the dialogic. The visual as something that's accessible, explorable, exchangeable. And Jean-Luc Godard, the French filmmaker, is one of my great favorites. You see what's happening here. You can deal with that. And when you remember there's another one, it's taken, Jerry Samba, he's from Congo. That's a narrative, like a strip. You explore, you find your way. And another example is Adam Curtis. Hypernormalization is also built up in situations where you have access to, where you deal with, that you remember. Dialogic. And that kind of approach has consequences for the way you you organize your pictures. They are always have a dynamic against the grain of the rules and against the grain. Use that to give you access. They are not all the time, here I am. No, it's a narrative. And that brings me to my last picture, Jean-Luc Godard, who says that you should always confront vague ideas with clear messages, visual messages. And that's what we are doing in the workshop. Thanks. That was very nice to do. Yeah. I hope it was a little bit clear. It was a kind of complicated message, but nevertheless. Sorry?
There's so many references, we should go back to...
Oh yeah, over there. Oh yeah. So
maybe we can use them all.
I'll put it down. Range of images we could have a look at. And the images should do the work.